In this lecture, I'd like to talk about price discrimination and the economic intuition and logic behind price discrimination. And to help us think about this, I'd like to go back to 1997. A global cell phone manufacturer, IRK, was losing sales in the Philippines because its competitors there were offering a better and lower price. So the Philippine market at that point was quickly approaching the 10% penetration point. One of the reasons that IRK was concerned about market share is because there's a rule of thumb that says the firm with the largest market share, when the market hits 10%, will grow to have a 40% market share when the market penetration reaches the 30% threshold. IRK realized that the Philippine market was quickly approaching this critical 10% threshold and wanted to do something to solidify their presence in the market. Now, at that time, IRK charged a worldwide uniform price of $120, and most of its phones were sold in wealthy countries, primarily Western Europe. Important future markets, emerging markets such as the Philippines, were largely ignored by IRK because the demand was relatively low in those countries compared to the wealthier countries where they had an established presence. And that makes sense. Cell phones, like many goods, are a normal good. A normal economic good is defined as a good whose demand increases when individuals' income increases. So the demand was somewhat lower in the Philippines, but the market was growing and approaching that 10% penetration point. Now, the competitors in the Philippines were underpricing IRK, not only in the Philippines but other developing markets, selling more than IRK and gaining market share more rapidly. So IRK considered charging a lower price in the Philippines, lower than its price charged elsewhere, the $120 price, in order to generate more sales and gain a toehold in the market before the market reached that 10% threshold. Now, this lecture looks at ways of profitably designing and implementing price discrimination strategies. A price discrimination strategy is one in which a seller can charge a different price to different customers based on differences in consumer demand. Price discrimination, when effectively employed, increases the profit above the level from setting a single uniform price. In the case of IRK, what they were considering was selling the same phone at different prices, a higher price in wealthier Western Europe and a lower price in the Philippines, even though it was essentially the same phone. Price discrimination can be effective and can increase a firm's profit if a seller can identify two groups of customers with different demand elasticities, and it can prevent arbitrage between the two groups. Arbitrage is defined as a riskless, instantaneous profit. It essentially involves finding two different markets and buying low and selling high. Not through time like you might do in the stock market, but going to the market where the good is cheaply priced and buying it, and then going to the market where it is more expensively priced and selling it. That's the basic idea of an arbitrage profit. And if a seller can prevent that, then they can profitably implement a price discrimination scheme. The key idea is to charge a higher price to the group with less demand elasticity, that is, less sensitivity to price. And so price discrimination is simply this. It's the practice of charging different people or groups of people different prices, and importantly, the differences in prices are not cost justified. It's not because they're necessarily selling a better or lesser product. We'll talk about that when we talk about indirect price discrimination, but it's because the different customer groups have different sensitivities to price. In other words, different demand elasticities. And typically, more people will be served and more people will buy the good or service under a price discrimination strategy than under a uniform price. And we'll look at some examples that illustrate that. Now, arbitrage always has to be in the back of the mind of any firm implementing price discrimination because arbitrage can defeat a price discrimination pricing strategy. If enough of those customers who buy at low prices are able to resell the product they bought to high-value customers. If this happens, it can force the seller to go back to a uniform price and abandon the price discrimination strategy. Price discrimination strategy, then, is one in which the firm can effectively identify members of either the low value, the more elastic group, or the high value, the less elastic group, and then charge them different prices and prevent the product from being resold between the two groups. This is what's known as direct price discrimination, when the firm can actually ID or identify which group, the high value or low value group, a particular customer belongs to. Some other important details are: one, it can be illegal for businesses to price discriminate when selling goods, not services, goods to other businesses, unless the price discounts are cost justified or the discounts are based on or in response to competitors' pricing. Now, some other points to bear in mind: price discrimination strategies may annoy customers, particularly those in the high value group, if they know that they're paying more than some other customers. Not only will this perhaps annoy them, it may also make them less willing to buy the product. So presentation, marketing, and image are, in this case, extremely important. Let's take a concrete example of price discrimination at work. Anybody who has diabetes or knows somebody with diabetes knows that it is extremely important for somebody with diabetes to monitor their blood glucose or blood sugar levels. And this is often done by using a test strip device. There's a small device and what's known as a test strip that's disposable, that's inserted into the device, and a small sample of blood is placed on the test strip, and the device reads the blood sugar present in the individual's blood. Now, in Northern Europe, so Germany, Holland, and Scandinavia, these machines sell for, on average, wholesale pricing, $25. And a box of 50 test strips sells for about $22. And the market here, on an annual basis, involves about 12 million boxes of test strips being sold. So you can do the math, but we're talking roughly $300 million in annual sales for the test strips. So there was a firm that was operating in Northern Europe, and they were contemplating expansion into Southern Europe, the Southern European market, where they did not have any market share. Now, in Southern Europe, particularly Italy and Spain, we see a couple of differences from Northern Europe. One is that the insurance companies in those countries, or the insurance programs, some of which are state-sponsored, reimburse at rates that are only about 50% of the Northern European rates. The firm that was contemplating expansion into Southern Europe already had the capacity to produce an additional 6 million boxes of test strips annually. And the market in Southern Europe had a potential value of almost $200 million per year. So if the firm, say, acquired 30% of the $200 million market, they were looking at an additional $60 million in revenue. So this was a potentially profitable expansion for this firm to undertake. But one of the key variables here, or moving parts, is the 50% lower reimbursement rates. Prices in Southern Europe were therefore lower. And the firm, recognizing that, decided to implement a lower pricing strategy. Essentially, the same devices were sold for about half the price, $12.50 in Southern Europe, and the test strips were manufactured and sold for $11 per box. Now, this is an example of price discrimination. Price discrimination rules and antitrust rules vary from country to country. So it happened that in the European marketplace where this company was operating, they had to do a couple of things in order for this price discrimination strategy to work. The first thing they had to do was just at a practical level. They needed to prevent the ability of people to go to the Southern Europe, buy these devices at half price, and then go back to Northern Europe and remarket them at the Northern European prices. To do this, they inserted a ROM key that basically made the devices sold in Southern Europe incompatible with those in Northern Europe. This is one reason that many of you are familiar with SIM cards that go into cell phones. This is one reason that those SIM cards are inserted to cell phones, and that this ROM key was inserted into the diabetic test strip device to ensure incompatibility between different markets where there was differential pricing going on. A second implementation or detail that faced this company, or that this company pursued, was that they actually reduced the measurement speed in the Southern European devices from 11 seconds to 25 seconds. In the case of the European marketplace where they were operating, it would have violated the antitrust laws to actually sell the identical products in both Northern and Southern Europe. So they made these devices slower. They cost a little bit less, so that there was some price difference and a little bit of cost justification for the differential pricing. Certainly nowhere near enough to justify the 50% differential, but it was enough to get around the antitrust laws. This also brings up an important point. With price discrimination, we're dealing with a whole spectrum of strategies. And so rather than focusing in on whether something is or is not cost justified, really the idea behind price discrimination is that there are differences in prices that go well beyond any cost-based justification in the pricing. Sometimes there's no cost justification. Other times, as with this diabetic test strip example, there was a small difference in price, a cost rather, and a very large difference in price. This certainly falls under the umbrella of a price discrimination strategy. Now, what's the economic logic behind price discrimination beyond, say, maybe in this case of the diabetic test strips being able to move into a second market? Well, the basic idea of price discrimination, or the benefit, can be best understood if we go back a step and consider a market where there's just a single product being sold at a single price, and the firm has to set that price. They face a fundamental pricing trade-off. If the price is set lower, the firm sells more units, quantity increases, but earns less on each unit sold. If the firm sets the price higher, they sell less, but they earn more on each unit sold. And there's a fundamental tension here, or trade-off. Now, marginal analysis tells us how to optimize around this trade-off. We optimize by selling the quantity and setting the price so that marginal revenue exactly equals marginal cost, or in other words, the actual margin exactly equals the optimal or profit maximizing margin, which is 1 over E, E being the elasticity of demand represented by the consumer group. Price discrimination allows sellers to avoid this trade-off. It allows them to set higher prices for some consumers, those who are willing to pay higher prices, and set lower prices for other consumers that they can identify as being willing to buy the product, but only at lower prices. They set two separate prices for two different groups of consumers. Let's go back to the example of IRK and the cell phone market in the Philippines. Part of the problem was that the Philippine phones used the same standard, GSM standard, as the higher priced European phones. And so IRK was facing an arbitrage problem. Arbitrage threatened the sales in the Philippines because there were about 15 million units being sold to, or being obtained and shipped to Western Europe and sold. To prevent this, the company sold models in the Philippines with SIM locks, which allow only calls to be placed on local operator networks. Now, about 15,000 of these phones were actually also sold in Western Europe by hackers who were able to unscramble the SIM lock before IRK changed the algorithm they used to generate the code and make arbitrage more difficult. So not only was it important for IRK to price the phones at a lower price point in the Philippines based on more price sensitivity in that market, but it was also important not only to try to prevent arbitrage, but to monitor the markets that they were operating in and continually refine their arbitrage prevention strategies. In 1998, IRK sold 200,000 phones in the Philippines, much better than the 50,000 phones that they had been selling before they implemented the pricing strategy. Their market share rose from 10% to 25% in 1 year, and by 1999, they returned to a global uniform pricing, and most of their competitors followed suit. In 2000, the Philippine cell phone market had reached a penetration rate of 12%, and IRK's market share rose to 34%. In this case, price discrimination wasn't a permanent strategy to be employed, but a short-term strategy to gain market share in a particular market that was quickly approaching a key market penetration threshold. I want to thank you for listening to this lecture on the economic logic behind price discrimination.